Most people think inflammation is something that only matters if you're already sick. A swollen ankle, a sore throat, something obvious, something temporary. But here's the thing, the real story of inflammation isn't loud at all. It's happening quietly at a low simmer inside almost every system in your body for years, and it's being driven by a molecular switch most people have never heard of. Stick with me here because I'm going to walk through the actual science, then give you a complete protocol and answer the questions I know you're already thinking of. Let's talk about chronic low-grade inflammation. Acute inflammation, the kind you feel with a cut or a sprained ankle, is actually a good thing. It's your immune system responding appropriately, healing the area, and then shutting itself back off once the job is done. But chronic inflammation is different. It's a low-level immune response that never fully switches off, simmering in the background, contributing to everything from joint stiffness to brain fog to fatigue to long-term cardiovascular and metabolic issues. Here's what this feels like day to day: waking up tired even after a full night of sleep, feeling puffier or achier than you think you should without any obvious injury, brain fog that seems to come and go without a clear pattern. Sound familiar? Most people don't connect these dots back to inflammation because there's no single obvious symptom pointing to it. It's diffuse, it's quiet, and it builds slowly enough that you adjust to feeling slightly worse without ever really noticing the decline happening. Okay, here's the good news. There's a specific compound sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now for most people that has been studied extensively for its ability to interrupt this exact inflammatory process at a molecular level. Ready? Let's get into it. The key concept here is something called NFKB, or nuclear factor kappa B. Here's the analogy I like to use. Think of NFKB like a master alarm switch inside your cells. When it's flipped on, it triggers a cascade of genes that produce inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines that spread the inflammatory message throughout your body. In acute situations, this alarm does exactly what it should. It sounds briefly, triggers appropriate healing, and then shuts back off. But in chronic low-grade inflammation, this alarm switch gets stuck in a partially on position, quietly triggering low levels of inflammatory signaling continuously, day after day, month after month. Here's the mechanism, step by step. Various triggers: poor diet, chronic stress, excess visceral fat, poor sleep, can keep nudging that NFKB switch toward the on position more often than it should be. Once activated, NFKB moves into the cell nucleus and switches on genes that produce inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 6 and TNF alpha. These cytokines circulate throughout your bloodstream, contributing to that diffuse whole body inflammatory state, affecting your joints, your blood vessels, your brain, and your energy levels all at once, often without a single obvious point of origin. Here's how this connects to aging specifically. Researchers have actually coined a term for this, inflammaging, describing how chronic low-grade inflammation tends to increase with age and how it's now considered a contributing factor in a wide range of age-related conditions, from cardiovascular disease to cognitive decline. It's not that inflammation causes aging entirely on its own, but it appears to be a significant accelerating factor across multiple body systems simultaneously. This is where the specific spice comes in, because certain compounds have been shown to directly inhibit that NFKB activation pathway, essentially calming that stuck alarm switch back down toward its properly regulated state. The spice is turmeric, and specifically its active compound, curcumin. Curcumin has been one of the most extensively studied natural compounds when it comes to inflammation, with a genuinely large body of laboratory and clinical research behind it, more than most spices or supplements people talk about casually in wellness spaces. Here's the mechanism. Curcumin has been shown in research to directly inhibit NFKB activation, essentially calming that stuck inflammatory alarm switch, reducing the production of those downstream inflammatory cytokines we just discussed. It also has direct antioxidant properties, neutralizing some of the free radicals that can trigger NFKB activation in the first place, addressing the problem from two distinct angles simultaneously, rather than relying on a single mechanism alone. Now, I want to be upfront and balanced here because a dramatic headline makes for a great hook, but the honest picture is a bit more nuanced than eliminates implies. Curcumin has strong laboratory evidence and a reasonable body of human clinical trials showing modest to meaningful reductions in inflammatory markers, particularly in conditions like osteoarthritis and certain inflammatory bowel conditions. It's not a guaranteed cure for chronic disease, and results vary significantly between individuals depending on genetics, baseline inflammation levels, and consistency of use. But among natural compounds studied for this specific purpose, it genuinely has one of the stronger evidence bases currently available. Here's the catch that most people miss entirely, and this is the detail that actually determines whether this works for you at all. Curcumin, taken on its own, is very poorly absorbed by your digestive system. The vast majority of it passes through without ever reaching meaningful levels in your bloodstream. This is exactly why some people try turmeric for a few weeks, see no difference, and give up, without realizing they were never actually absorbing enough of it to matter in the first place. Research has shown that combining curcumin with piperine, the active compound found in black pepper, can increase curcumin absorption by as much as 2,000%. Because piperine inhibits an enzyme in your liver and gut that would otherwise rapidly break curcumin down before it ever gets absorbed into your bloodstream. The dose studied for meaningful anti-inflammatory effect is typically around 500 to 1,000 milligrams of curcumin daily, combined with a small amount of piperine, ideally taken with a meal containing some dietary fat, since curcumin is fat-soluble and absorbs noticeably better alongside fat in the same meal. My tip: if you're using turmeric in cooking rather than a supplement, always pair it with black pepper and cook it in oil, ghee, or coconut oil. A turmeric latte made with just hot water and turmeric powder, with no fat and no black pepper, is genuinely one of the least effective ways to consume it, even though it's become a popular wellness trend on social media over the past several years. Now, curcumin isn't the only compound worth knowing about here, so let's go through a few others that work through related but genuinely distinct pathways, since a comprehensive approach tends to work better than relying on any single compound alone. Ginger, specifically its active compound gingerol, has been studied for its ability to inhibit similar inflammatory pathways, including some of the same cytokine production we discussed with curcumin. Research has shown regular ginger intake, about 1 to 2 grams daily, roughly a teaspoon of fresh grated ginger, is associated with modest reductions in inflammatory markers, particularly muscle soreness after exercise and some markers relevant to joint discomfort. Omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, found in fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, and sardines, work through a genuinely different pathway, getting converted into signaling molecules called resolvins and protectins that actively resolve inflammation rather than simply blocking it upstream. This is a meaningfully different mechanism than curcumin's NFKB inhibition, which is part of why combining both approaches rather than relying on just one tends to be a more comprehensive strategy overall. The dose studied is around 2 to 3 grams combined EPA and DHA daily, either through diet or a quality supplement. Green tea, specifically its EGCG content, has antioxidant properties that reduce the oxidative triggers that can activate NFKB in the first place, working somewhat upstream of where curcumin acts directly on the switch itself. 3 to 4 cups daily is the dose most commonly used in research examining this compound's anti-inflammatory potential. And I want to add a fourth one here that often gets left out of these conversations: garlic, specifically its compound allicin, formed when raw garlic is crushed or chopped. Allicin has demonstrated anti-inflammatory properties in laboratory research, partly through modest inhibition of the same inflammatory cytokine pathways and partly through its antioxidant effects. 1 to 2 cloves of raw or lightly cooked garlic daily, crushed and left to sit for about 10 minutes before cooking to maximize allicin formation, is a reasonable target based on the available research. Now, if you're finding this helpful, this is exactly the kind of thing I like breaking down on this channel, taking apart the actual mechanisms behind common wellness claims, with the honest nuance included, not just the sensational headline without the full picture. So if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe because there's a lot more of this coming. Let's talk about diet more broadly here, because chronic inflammation is heavily influenced by overall dietary patterns, not just any single spice or supplement added on top of an otherwise unchanged diet. Refined sugar and highly processed foods have been shown repeatedly to increase inflammatory markers, partly through their effect on blood sugar spikes and partly through their effect on gut bacteria composition. Since certain processed food components can disrupt the balance of beneficial versus inflammatory gut bacteria strains. Reducing these, rather than relying entirely on anti-inflammatory additions layered on top, is arguably just as important as adding curcumin or omega-3s to your routine. Fiber deserves a real mention here too, since your gut bacteria produce compounds called short-chain fatty acids when they ferment fiber, and these compounds have direct anti-inflammatory effects throughout your body, including effects on that same NF-κB pathway we've been discussing. Aiming for 25 to 35 grams of fiber daily from vegetables, legumes, and whole grains supports this pathway meaningfully and shouldn't be overlooked in favor of supplements alone. Let's talk about sleep and stress too, because they tie directly back into that NF-κB switch we discussed earlier, and neither can be fully compensated for by diet alone. Poor sleep has been shown in controlled studies to directly increase NF-κB activation and inflammatory marker levels, sometimes within just a single night of significant sleep restriction. Aiming for 7 to 8 hours consistently is a direct, measurable lever on this same inflammatory pathway, and arguably one of the most impactful single changes available, since sleep affects nearly every other system we've discussed today as well. Chronic stress raises cortisol, and while cortisol is actually anti-inflammatory in the short term, chronically elevated cortisol paradoxically leads to a kind of cortisol resistance over time, where your cells stop responding properly to its anti-inflammatory signal, allowing inflammation to increase despite high cortisol levels being present in your bloodstream. Simple daily practices like a short walk, a few minutes of deep breathing, or consistent time outdoors have all been shown to help regulate this system back toward balance over time. Let's talk about exercise too, since it has a genuinely interesting, almost paradoxical relationship with inflammation worth understanding. Intense exercise causes a brief, acute spike in inflammatory markers immediately afterward, but regular moderate exercise over time is associated with lower baseline chronic inflammation overall. It's a case of short-term stress producing long-term resilience, similar to how a brief challenge can strengthen a system rather than weaken it. As long as adequate recovery time is included between sessions and you're not chronically overtraining without rest. Let's talk about gut health specifically, since it deserves its own dedicated mention given how tightly connected it is to systemic inflammation. Your gut lining, when healthy, acts as a selective barrier, but chronic poor diet, stress, and certain medications can weaken this barrier, allowing bacterial fragments to leak into your bloodstream, a phenomenon that directly triggers NF-κB activation and contributes meaningfully to that chronic low-grade inflammatory state we've been discussing throughout this video. Fermented foods like plain yogurt, kefir, and sauerkraut, along with the fiber intake we already discussed, support a healthier gut barrier over time. Let's talk timeline, because I want to set realistic expectations here rather than promising something unrealistic. Some people notice subjective improvements in energy and joint comfort within 2 to 3 weeks of consistently taking curcumin with piperine. Measurable changes in blood inflammatory markers, if checked through blood work, typically take 4 to 8 weeks of consistent use to show a clear shift. This isn't an overnight fix, and it works best as one part of a broader anti-inflammatory approach, alongside diet, sleep, and exercise, rather than as a single standalone solution you add without changing anything else. This isn't a replacement for medical care if you have a diagnosed inflammatory or autoimmune condition. These approaches work well alongside medical treatment, not instead of it. And any significant, persistent symptoms should always be evaluated by a doctor. Let me answer a few common questions, since I know these will be on your mind. First, is curcumin really as effective as a dramatic headline might suggest? The honest answer is that curcumin has genuinely strong laboratory evidence and a reasonable body of clinical research behind it, more than most natural compounds available. But eliminates chronic inflammation is a strong claim, and the real picture is more like meaningfully reduces inflammatory markers in many people, particularly when properly absorbed and used consistently. It's a genuinely promising, well-studied compound, not a guaranteed cure for every inflammatory condition. Second, are there any risks to taking curcumin supplements regularly? Curcumin is generally considered safe at studied doses, but it can have mild blood thinning effects and may interact with certain medications, including blood thinners and some diabetes medications. Check with your doctor before starting, especially if you're on any prescription medication or have an upcoming surgery. Third, can I just eat more turmeric in my cooking instead of taking a supplement? Yes, dietary turmeric, properly paired with black pepper and some fat, does provide meaningful curcumin intake and is a genuinely reasonable approach for many people. Supplements simply make it easier to hit a specific, higher, more consistent dose, which matters more if you're targeting a specific inflammatory condition rather than general wellness maintenance. Fourth, how do I know if I actually have chronic low-grade inflammation in the first place? Your doctor can check specific blood markers, including something called C-reactive protein, or CRP, which is one of the more commonly used indicators of systemic inflammation. If you're experiencing the symptoms we discussed at the start of this video, persistent fatigue, unexplained achiness, recurring brain fog, it's reasonable to ask your doctor about checking this marker directly rather than guessing based on symptoms alone. So here's the bigger picture I want you to walk away with. This was never just about a trendy spice you sprinkle on your food. It's about a specific molecular switch, NFKB, that determines whether your body maintains a healthy, appropriately brief inflammatory response or gets stuck in a chronic, low-grade state that quietly affects your energy, your joints, your brain, and your long-term health across every system simultaneously. Curcumin, properly absorbed alongside black pepper, ginger, omega-3s, garlic, and overall dietary and lifestyle patterns, all work on different pieces of that same underlying system. Combine these consistently, and you're giving your body real evidence-informed tools to help regulate that inflammatory switch rather than just waiting for symptoms to show up before reacting to them after the fact. If you want to go deeper, my next video breaks down the specific blood markers you can ask your doctor to check if you want to actually measure your own inflammation levels, rather than just guessing based on symptoms alone. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. I'll see you in the next one.